Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again back looking at the past to developers for August of 2020. This is the last video that I'm going to do for August because to be honest we've looked at everything else, so this is the last bit. We have a map by Kasu which is looking at August 1944, the Liberation of Paris map. And the reason why I wanted to dedicate this to its own video is because he actually does a really good job of explaining the history of this map and also, why it would be nice to see it in the game. So the first thing to understand is the liberation of France is kind of already covered in War Thunder. It has the Normandy maps, which are considered semi-historical. The War Thunder maps, if you have a look at the Normandy map, it's normally a bunch of different geographical places kind of smashed together, and therefore it's not a single place in Normandy, but it does have a lot of aspects of Normandy, which is really nice. The landscape itself is from the same area, but there is no actual historical map for this area, and there's also no actual historical map for late war battles in France in the game. You got the Maginot Line map. This is another semi-historical map because there's a lake there, when in actuality, in the place where it's based off, there ain't a lake, and this obviously represents an area of France which saw combat in 1940, with, of course, the invasion of France by the Germans. And the idea by Kasukaru here is to add a very iconic historical map for combined battles. So that would be ground realistic, and I'm sure this could be moved to ground arcade as well. And the liberation of Paris, was the one that was picked. So from the 19th to the 26th of August 1944. Now let's talk about this, because I've talked about the liberation of Paris a decent amount, sometimes in videos, sometimes on streams, and it's an interesting one because there is definitely a battle of egos which goes on when it comes to it. And basically it starts off with, after the push outside of Normandy in July of 1944, and also taking over Argentan at the beginning of August 1944, the Allied forces were very close to the French capital. The fact of this was not lost too much on the Allied and the German high command, and neither on the various resistance groups in and around Paris, nor the actual militia, the Vichy collaborators. So everybody knew what was going on. That's kind of obvious. But the most acutely aware was, of course, de Gaulle. General de Gaulle, as he was known, politician, leader, lover, who knows, it could be a little bit of everything. And he was, at the time, the Free French leader. And the division General Leclerc. And heading the 2nd Armoured Division of the Free French, was Leclerc, and himself under the command of US General Gouraud, and also Bradley, who didn't really like him, let's put it like that, and ultimately, of course, General Eisenhower. Leclerc was still a rather inexperienced leader. He had a bunch of qualities, but patience he lacked, unfortunately. And he actually lobbied for the honor of liberating the city. So he wanted to be the person who was on the face when Paris was being liberated. And of course, this wasn't in the Allied plans because, a lot of them didn't think about glory. They thought about how to get the job done. So Allied High Command, the idea was to avoid the city, to force the Germans to leave it without a street fight. And the German orders were to burn the city to the ground before leaving it. And of course, this would have been pretty bad. But neither of the leaders on the ground obeyed their specific orders, though, and a strange battle ensued between forces who had originally no intention to engage each other. So this is why, the whole thing is kind of interesting, with what's going on here. It is kind of a weird and wonderful fight, which of course cost many lives. It started around the 19th of August. There was a general strike in and around occupied Paris and an insurrection of the police, the gendarmerie, the fire brigades and other civil servants as well. They were quickly joined and soon commanded by the FFI, which were mostly communist resistance fighters, led by Colonel Roll Tanguy. The German repression was very disorganized, and this basically meant that in some places negotiations led to an uneasy truce, and in others local resistance were purely and simply gunned down on the spot or arrested and immediately sent to concentration camps for extermination. The locals soon put their hands on a S-35, the Samua, a pack cannon and a couple of Mercedes, while the Germans were fielding everything from an ancient Renault F-15 of the Paris Panzer Company to a dozen of Panther Gs of the Lear Division. The resistance fighter reports abundantly quote Tiger tanks, but it doesn't seem like there were any Tiger tanks there. Instead, there were just a few Panthers, and then, as we talked about, the F-15. And there was use of Panthers, also 47mm Panzer Jaegers, armoured cars, half-tracks, and also German-captured Renault R-35s, R-40s, Samua, and also B-1 Bisses. Several of these tanks were subsequently recaptured by the FFI during the battle and immediately put to use, sometimes against identical vehicles. That must have been incredibly confusing. The German pioneers also mined the bridges and main monuments of Paris, but von Cholich never gave the fateful order to blow them up. The charges were eventually disabled by the specialized Allied units on the last 2 days of the battle. So, hearing reports of the insurrection and repression that was going on, Leclerc lobbied his commanding officers to make a run for the capital, basically trying to, get involved. He went all the way to de Gaulle and also Bradley, and eventually the request was passed to Eisenhower, who gave him the authorization to go, but asked the US 4th Infantry Division of General Barton to support him. Leclerc was supposed to wait for Barton's men to engage, but had already sent 3 M4A3 Shermans and the entirety of La Neuve half-track recon unit, which was actually manned by Spanish Republican volunteers, ahead to try and join the resistance fighters. The result was complete chaos. The eager but inexperienced French inadvertently preventing the US Army to position themselves for the attack and falling on unexpected anti-tank German positions, basically 88 pack guns all over the place, and nevertheless the 2nd DB, which was of course the armored division, eventually overcame some of these obstacles and then eventually all of them, rushing over the surprised German defenses and succeeding in joining the FFI resistance at the Hotel de Ville building on the 24th of August. During that evening, the US infantry managed to join the fight, and the last assault took place on the 25th. The sheer number of Allied tanks, infantry, and everything else overwhelmed the Germans, who were isolated and demoralized at that point. The German Luftwaffe did provide some bomber support, but was mostly kept from the skies by, of course, the air power of the Allies, which was superior at the time. The rest was the mopping up of pockets of fanatic resistance by snipers and SS units, and then on the 26th, de Gaulle entered Paris with Leclerc under the acclamation of the crowd, despite some remaining sniper fire, and declared the city free as the capital of the new French Republic. The Germans mounted only one bombing raid after that on Paris. It was on the night of the 26th, with 111 Ju-88s and Ju-188s. 2 planes failed to take off. 2 were shot down by the M16s of the 4th US Infantry Division, and the mounted 20mm Bofors of the French 2nd DB. and having little actual goals, the bombing can hardly be considered a success, apart from the direct hit on the Republican Guards barracks, which killed 13 French soldiers. In total, the raid killed a little less than 200 people and destroyed about 800 buildings and factories. No Allied interceptor intervened, as all US and British night fighters were still concentrated in Normandy. So, although about 1,300 soldiers from the French colonies did participate in the liberation of Paris, directly or indirectly, there was only one black officer who was actually allowed to enter the city, and this was because, although French forces were relatively inclusive, US forces were strictly segregated and didn't allow African Americans in tank units or on the front lines. So, it just shows how times have changed, especially during nowadays. So that is an overview of, the liberation of Paris, a hectic fight when it came to, World War II, one which had many twists and turns, and hopefully will at some point be represented in some form of history. So here's the proposed map from all of this talk, and the map would of course be urban, and it should be reserved to 6.0 BR. That's according to here to keep it historical vehicles. I don't really believe that, but it is how it is. And the idea would be to concentrate on a small area, maybe 2 of central Paris's arrondissement for the actual ground gaming area, parts of the 1st and the 8th. And also he's chosen the Rue de Rivoli, the Champs-Élysées, and also the Place de la Concorde on the northern bank of the Seine, and the theatre of the thickest and bloodiest of the tank action. This would provide both open areas and also close-quarter fighting. The entire Paris area and closer suburbs can be used for the air part of the map, and then to respect some historical accuracy, one camp, which will be the Allies, will attack from the south and the west, and the other, which would be the Germans, from the north and the east, although in reality the German tanks were surrounded by, they were defending, so they were surrounding, getting attacked from everywhere. This should reflect the main tank duels on the 25th of August between the 2nd Armored Division Shermans and the Easy-8 M4s, or the M10 Wolverines, and the counterattacking Panther Gs, and the SDKFC-11 Flak 38s of the motley crew of the German defenders. On top of their M3A1 half-tracks and M4, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3s, the French also brought in the city a couple of M31 recovery vehicles, some M3A3 light tanks, the Stuarts, Priests, the 105mm SPGs, the M8 Scott also made it, and also some M8 recon vehicles. So the general idea, would be to try and create a historical map around the center of Paris. And you could definitely do that, when we actually, have a look at the area. Most of the buildings would be intact at this point. Obviously the bombings came after this point, and the streets were completely empty at the time, apart from maybe some damaged urban furniture, so benches, lampposts, stuff like that, and maybe some made barricades. But the reason why this area has been chosen, so A is Elysee Palace, C on the central garden of tactical importance, because it's overviewing both the Champs-Élysées and the Tuileries area, and B being the Roosevelt's roundabout, which exists today. There's also a metro station giving access to the rest of the city. You could enlarge or reduce the area to have the main German command centers as objectives, etc. Spawn points would obviously not be historical, as this would make the map terribly unbalanced. So yeah, the idea here is to try and take a historical fight and turn it into a War Thunder map. A cool little history behind it, and something that basically I wanted to talk about. I could have easily just, gone over this one and just been, yep, it's the center of Paris map, this is what the areas that it's looking at, but I thought, why not give some additional context for a little bit of fun. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Trigger Hippie, Universe, Conte Baraka, Elove Goat, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hans, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.